When you look at how history is usually taught, there's this overwhelming expectation of clean, sharp lines.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. Like, it's almost like looking at a piece of modern architecture or something. You look at a timeline in a standard textbook, and the historian just points a finger and says, right here, in 476 AD, the Roman Empire falls. Draw a line.
Draw a line, the Dark Ages begin.
Exactly. Draw another line, the Renaissance starts.
Yeah, it's very binary. We love our eras to be highly visible and easily categorized. And, most importantly, we love them to have a definite start and a definite end. It's comforting to our sense of order, I think.
It is. It's incredibly comforting. You have your golden age over here, your dark age over there. But, when you step into the world of Islamic intellectual history, that timeline just absolutely shatters.
Oh, completely. It falls apart.
The lines aren't just blurred, they're completely broken.
Yeah.
We're looking at a historical landscape that is incredibly complex, and honestly, to a lot of outside observers, it looks completely murky.
It is the absolute definition of historical muddy waters, and that's primarily because the narrative we've been handed is just, it's missing massive pieces of the puzzle.
Right. Which is why we are so glad you're joining us for this deep dive today, because we are setting out on a mission to completely shatter one of the most persistent and, frankly, most misleading myths in intellectual history.
It really is a pervasive myth.
It is. Like, if you happen to open a standard Western textbook on the history of philosophy, you usually find a chapter on Islamic thought. But here's the crazy part. That chapter almost always abruptly ends in the 12th century.
Right, they just cut it off.
Yeah, it usually stops right after the death of the great philosopher Ibn Rushd, who is often known in the West as Averroes. Or, maybe it puts a hard stop right after the Mongol invasion of Baghdad.
Right. And the implicit or even sometimes explicit narrative there is that after this specific point in the 12th or 13th century, the Islamic world just fell into a state of complete and utter decadence.
Like it just stopped thinking.
Exactly. The assumption is that there was this massive intellectual vacuum, right? Like a philosophical dark age that lasted for centuries where original thought just completely ceased to exist.
Which is wild when you actually think about it. It's a dangerous illusion. It effectively separates present-day Muslims from their own rich intellectual tradition by inserting, half a millennium of presumed emptiness?
Yeah, it's a huge gap. But as we're about to see, the reality on the ground was entirely different.
Totally different. Far from an intellectual vacuum, there were vibrant, just earth-shattering philosophical movements happening.
They just weren't happening in the places or, in the specific languages that later Western historians were bothering to look at.
Exactly. And to guide us through this hidden reality, we are diving into a massive stack of notes and translated excerpts from A History of Muslim Philosophy, Volume 2.
Which is such a dense, incredible resource.
It really is. We are going to focus specifically on a spectacular, almost unbelievable intellectual renaissance that occurred in Safavid Persia. We're exploring what is known as the School of Isfahan and its absolute crowning genius, a man named Mullah Sadra.
And it is a fascinating journey.
I promise you a journey into a world where advanced mathematics, mystical poetry, monumental architecture, and, divine illumination were not separate disciplines. They were woven together into a single, breathtaking tapestry of reality. Okay, let's unpack this before we can even touch the philosophy of Mullah Sadra. We really have to understand the soil that this whole movement grew in.
Right, the historical context is everything here.
Yeah, we have to look at the sudden explosive rise of the Safavid dynasty in Persia.
And this is, honestly, one of the most fascinating political origin stories in history. Because the Safavid dynasty did not start the way most empires do.
How do you mean?
Well, they didn't start as a traditional political faction or a military junta or even a wealthy merchant class. The Safavid dynasty actually began as a mystical Sufi brotherhood.
Wait, a Sufi brotherhood? As in, mystics focus on inner spiritual purification.
Yes, exactly.
How does a group like that suddenly end up running an empire?
It is a remarkable trajectory, isn't it? This marks one of the very rare instances in history where a mystical order, specifically Islamic mysticism, takes direct, total control of the social and political life of a massive region.
That's just wild.
Right. So they traced their spiritual lineage and actually their name back to a highly revered 13th century saint named Sheikh Safi al-Din Ardibili.
Okay, so Sheikh Safi was essentially a spiritual guide, like a respected elder.
Exactly. He lived in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. He wasn't a warlord at all, He was a spiritual leader whose teachings attracted this massive following, and his tomb in the city of Ardabil actually became and still remains a major place of pilgrimage.
Oh, wow.
And after he passed, the Sufi order didn't just dissolve, you know. It continued to grow and organize under the spiritual direction of his direct descendants.
And there is this fantastic visual detail from the source text that I just absolutely love. As this order grew over the next century, so right around the 15th century, the members adopted a very specific, highly visible piece of headgear to identify themselves.
Right, the hats.
Yeah, it was a 12-sided red hat, and the 12 sides represented the 12 imams of Shia Islam.
Huh.
Because of this bright red hat, the surrounding populations gave them a nickname, the Qizilbash, which literally translates from Turkish to redheads.
Qizilbash. And they were fiercely loyal to the spiritual head of their order. And as they grew in numbers, they were operating in a Persia that was, well, at that time, incredibly disorganized politically.
Like highly fragmented, right?
Extremely. It was ruled by various local tribal leaders and smaller factions. So the Qizilbash became a highly organized, highly motivated force within that chaos. And eventually, this purely spiritual movement became a military one.
Which is quite the pivot.
It really is. Under the leadership of Shah Ismail, who was crowned in the city of Tabriz in 1499, this army of Sufi mystics succeeded in defeating all the local rulers. They unified the entire territory of Persia.
Which is just a monumental shift. I mean, functionally speaking, that is the first time Persia had been completely politically unified since the fall of the ancient Sassanid Empire, centuries before the rise of Islam.
It completely redrew the map of the Middle East, and with that political unification came a massive sweeping religious shift as well.
Right, because before the Safavids, the population of Persia was a really complex mix of Sunni and Shia Muslims.
Yeah, but Shah Ismail made a definitive decree. He said that under the new Safavid Empire, 12 Imam Shi'ism would become the official, exclusive state religion.
And this right here, this moment of establishing a state religion, is where the intellectual focus of the entire culture begins to violently shift.
Precisely. To understand why the philosophy of the School of Isfahan looks the way it does, you really have to understand the psychology of the Shia intellectual community before and after this exact moment.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So before the Safavids, the Shia community was often a marginalized and, frankly, frequently persecuted minority.
And when you're a persecuted minority, your intellectual energy isn't exactly focused on building, expansive, abstract theories of the universe.
No, not at all.
Your energy goes entirely into survival.
Exactly. Your intellectual energy goes into defense. So, prior to the Safavids, their theological tradition, which is known as Kalam, was highly developed, but it functioned essentially as a defensive mechanism.
So Kalam was about protection.
Yes. Kalam was designed to build logical walls around the truths of their revelation to protect those truths from false reasoning or from the attacks of the majority sects. It was like this hard intellectual shell protecting the inner spiritual life of the community.
But suddenly, literally overnight, the Qizilbash conquer the region, and the persecuted minority is now the state. They have total control.
Right, the paradigm flips entirely.
So they don't need that defensive shell in the same way anymore. There's no external intellectual force molesting them within their own borders. So Kalam, that defensive theology, naturally loses some of its earlier urgency.
It does, but on the flip side, they now have a massive unified empire to run. And as we know, you can't run an empire purely on mystical poetry.
Right, you cannot. You need laws, courts, taxation systems, property rights. So their tradition of jurisprudence, which is known as fiqh, had to rapidly and massively develop to handle real-world practical state problems.
Exactly. The legal and social frameworks of a functioning society had to be constructed almost from scratch based on Shia principles.
Okay, so we have a drop in defensive theology, Kalam, and a massive spike in strict legal bureaucracy, fiqh. Now, history is pretty consistent on this point. When a state suddenly requires strict legal frameworks, when the bureaucrats and the lawyers take over, that usually stifles mystical, abstract, or highly creative philosophy.
Oh, almost always. The bureaucrats usually view the mystics as unpredictable. Or even dangerous.
Exactly. So why didn't this new state apparatus just stamp out all the esoteric, mystical thought? Why did an entirely new philosophical movement, which they call Hikmat, suddenly thrive in this highly legalized environment?
It's a brilliant question because you're absolutely right. Usually the lawyers and the mystics are at each other's throats. But in the Safavid context, they weren't seen as mutually exclusive.
Why not?
Well, the Shia culture of Persia, particularly with its roots in that Sufi brotherhood, actively synthesized them. This new environment of political safety, combined with their total cultural dominance, provided the absolute perfect greenhouse for Hikmat.
We should probably define Hikmat clearly for everyone listening, because it really is the beating heart of this entire deep dive.
We should. So Hikmat translates roughly to wisdom or theosophy.
Oh.
But in 16th century Persia, it refers to a very specific, highly developed intellectual tradition. It's a grand synthesis.
What's it blending together?
It blends the esoteric, hidden teachings of the Shia imams, the Illuminationist wisdom of a 12th century philosopher named Suhrawardi, the pure, overwhelming mysticism of the great Andalusian Sufi Ibn Arabi, and this is the crucial part, the rigorous rational philosophy of the Greeks, specifically Aristotle and Plato, usually filtered through earlier Muslim thinkers like Avicenna.
Wait, I'm stuck on that last part.
Yeah.
Logic is usually the end of the road in Western philosophy, right? You build a flawless logical proof, you establish your premises, you draw your conclusion, and you're done.
Right.
So how does strict Aristotelian logic blend with the pure mysticism of someone like Ibn Arabi? That sounds like trying to use, I don't know, a calculus textbook to achieve a spiritual high. How does Hikmat actually work in practice?
That tension is exactly what makes Hikmat so revolutionary. In the School of Isfahan, Hikmat isn't just fluffy, abstract mysticism where you sit in a circle and talk about your feelings.
Right.
It is profoundly rigorous. It starts with hard-nosed, punishing logic. A student of Hikmat had to master mathematics, astronomy, and the peripatetic philosophy of Aristotle. They had to know how to construct an airtight syllogism. But, and this is the key difference, instead of remaining bound to the flat plane of human reason, they use this strict logic merely as a springboard.
So the logic is just the preparation. It isn't the final destination.
Exactly. They believe that you must prepare and train the mind with logic to prevent yourself from falling into delusion. But the ultimate goal of all that logical training is spiritual ecstasy, the catharsis of the soul, and the direct intuitive illumination of the intellect by God.
So logic clears the runway, but spiritual realization is the flight.
That's a great way to put it. It is the absolute marriage of formal, book-learned knowledge and direct, experiential spiritual realization.
Okay, so the greenhouse is built. Safavid Persia is unified, secure, culturally dominant, and actively cultivating this incredible, demanding blend of strict logic and soaring mysticism. Now, we get to look at the wildly diverse, borderline eccentric masterminds who actually planted the seeds in this greenhouse.
The pioneers.
Right. We are zooming in on the early days of the School of Isfahan, looking at the men who set the stage for our main subject, Mullah Sadra. And the first pioneer we really have to meet is a man named Shaykh Baha al-Din Amili, who is much better known simply as Shaykh Baha'i. And looking at his resume in the source text, this guy is the absolute definition of a Renaissance man.
He truly is in every conceivable sense of the word. He was born in Baalbek in what is now Lebanon in 1546, and he moved to Persia as a teenager. And his intellectual capacity was just terrifying. Oh, yeah. He quickly became the leading theologian and jurist of his entire era. He was eventually appointed as the Shaykh al-Islam of Isfahan, which means he was at the absolute center of the religious and legal establishment. He was the highest religious authority in the capital of the entire empire.
Which means he had an immense amount of worldly power, political influence, and wealth at his fingertips.
He did. But despite his proximity to the Safavid court and all the trappings of elite bureaucracy, he was, at his core, a Gnostic, a mystic.
Really?
Yeah, he actually spent the later years of his life walking away from that power, traveling anonymously with wandering dervishes, actively seeking spiritual poverty.
And it wasn't just theology and mysticism with him either. He was an incredibly practical genius. He was the leading architect of the period.
A master builder.
Yeah. If you go to Isfahan today and look at the stunning Shah Mosque with its incredible acoustics and geometric perfection, Shaykh Baha'i was the leading architect behind it. And the text mentions this amazing, almost mythical legend about him building a public bathhouse in Isfahan. Apparently, it was engineered so perfectly, the water was kept constantly hot by a single solitary candle.
Right, right. And, you know, whether that is historical fact or a slight exaggeration of his engineering prowess over the centuries, it speaks to exactly how he was viewed by his contemporaries.
A true polymath.
Exactly. He also single-handedly revived the study of mathematics and astronomy in Persia. He wrote standard textbooks on algebra, geometry, and the use of the astrolabe, that were so brilliant and comprehensive, they were used in schools for centuries after his death.
Wow.
He was universally respected, the strict theologians respected him, the natural historians relied on him, the logicians deferred to him, and the wandering Sufis considered him a master.
But here's the paradox that I find so incredibly fascinating about him. Despite being the absolute undisputed master of all these formal sciences, I mean, he literally wrote the book on math, astronomy, architecture, and jurisprudence. His poetry constantly and sometimes ruthlessly mocked formal science.
It did.
He wrote this incredibly famous long poem called The Cat and the Mouse.
It is a brilliant piece of literature. In The Cat and the Mouse, he uses the cat to symbolize formal, exoteric knowledge.
So like the knowledge you get from books and logic.
Exactly. The knowledge from books, strict logic, jurisprudence. The cat is powerful, it follows the rules, it hunts down errors. But the mouse symbolizes esotericism, the inner hidden truth, the spiritual intuition that always manages to just slip away from the rigid claws of the cat.
He is constantly warning his students about the danger of hypocrisy in exoteric religion. He emphasizes over and over that intellectual, spiritual intuition is supremely higher than just discursive logical knowledge.
Yeah.
He was basically telling his students, look, I mastered all of this stuff, and I'm telling you, it isn't enough.
Yes.
And to illustrate this, he tells this hilarious yet profoundly deep story in his writings about a so-called madman named Bulul and a very pompous Mutazilite imam.
Oh, this is a great story. But we should pause and explain the Mutazilites first because they are the perfect foil for this anecdote.
Good idea.
The Mutazilites were an early, highly influential school of Islamic theology known for their uncompromising, strict rationalism. They believed that human reason could deduce the absolute nature of God and morality, and they often subordinated literal interpretations of Scripture to pure, rational proofs.
So they were the ultimate cats, in Shaykh Baha'i's metaphor.
Precisely. The ultimate cats.
Right. So Bulul, who plays the role of the holy fool, the man who possesses inner wisdom but looks crazy to the outside world, he hides a solid clay brick under his clothes.
A brick.
Yeah, a literal brick. And he goes into the mosque specifically to listen to this highly rationalist Mutazilite imam give a sermon. And during the sermon, the imam makes 3 specific, highly logical claims about reality and theology.
Right. So first, the imam applies strict categorical logic to the concept of hell. He says that Satan will not actually be harmed in hell.
Right, why not?
Because, he says, Satan is made of fire and hell is made of fire. Logically, a thing cannot be harmed by its own kind. Fire cannot burn fire.
Okay, I mean, logically, if you accept the premises, the conclusion follows. What is the second claim?
Second, the imam wades into the really heavy waters of free will versus predestination, and he concludes that all actions, both good and evil, are done entirely by divine consent. God is the author of all acts, therefore absolutely nothing happens outside of his direct will.
And the third claim?
Third, he tackles the nature of revelation and the afterlife, claiming that on the day of judgment, human beings will actually be able to see God with their physical anatomical eyes.
Okay, so Bulul is sitting in the back of the mosque listening to this incredibly smug display of pure rationalism, and he's getting increasingly irritated. But he waits until the very climax of the sermon, right when the imam confidently declares that humans will see God with their physical eyes. Then Bulul stands up, pulls the solid clay brick out from under his cloak, throws it as hard as he can, cracks the imam right on the head, and runs out of the mosque.
It's absolute chaos. The imam is bleeding. The congregation is in a total uproar. Eventually, the local caliph hears about this assault and is furious. He summons Bulul to the royal court to answer for what he's done.
And Bulul walks into the court, totally calm, totally unfazed, and basically says to the caliph, "Your Highness, please let me explain. I didn't just assault him. I have just perfectly disproved his entire rationalist sermon using his exact own logic."
He's so bold.
It is. Bulul points to the imam, who is standing there with a bandaged head. Bulul says, the imam claimed in his first point that a thing cannot harm its own kind, so fire can't hurt Satan. Well, this brick I threw is made of clay, and the imam's head, being human, is fundamentally made of clay. So according to his own airtight logic, he shouldn't be hurt right now. Why is he bleeding?
It is a devastating physical proof against a flawed abstract premise, but Bulul doesn't stop there.
He doesn't. Bulul turns to the bleeding imam and asks, "Did you feel pain when the brick hit you? Can you physically see the pain?" The imam, highly confused, says, "Of course I felt it, but no, I cannot see the pain. Pain is a feeling, not an object." So Bulul pounces.
He springs the trap.
He says, If you cannot even see the pain, which is merely a minor creation of God residing inside your own head, how on earth do you expect to physically see the Creator himself on the Day of Judgment?
Right. He is completely exposing the absurdity of applying physical limitations like eyesight to the metaphysical reality of the divine.
And finally, Blul delivers the knockout blow. He looks at the Caliph and says, "And regarding my punishment." Since the Imam claimed in his second point that all acts in the universe are done through divine consent, God must have explicitly consented to me throwing the brick at his head. So the Imam really shouldn't be complaining, and you really shouldn't be punishing me.
It is a brilliant, layered, philosophical takedown dressed up as a slapstick joke. The Imam, who symbolizes pure, arrogant rationalism, is left completely speechless and humiliated by Bulul. Bulul symbolizes that intellectual intuition, that Hikmat, that sees through the fragile, often flawed constructs of pure logic when it tries to overstep its bounds.
Shaykh Baha'i wrote this incredibly powerful line summing up this philosophy. He said that formal science is nothing but altercation. It continually brings congelation to man's nature. He's basically telling his students, you can't just lick the bowl of Avicenna and Aristotle forever.
That's a great image.
Memorizing syllogisms will literally freeze your soul. At some point, you have to wash the slate of your heart clean and learn what he called the science of love.
That intense productive tension between mastering formal learning and then transcending it for spiritual awakening is the defining characteristic of the School of Isfahan. And we see this tension take a very different, highly complex form in the next major pioneer we need to discuss, Mir Damad.
Mir Damad. He was an absolute giant in this era. He was actually known in scholarly circles as the third teacher, which is a staggering title because the first teacher was Aristotle and the second teacher was Al-Farabi. To be called the third teacher means you are considered one of the foundational pillars of human thought.
A true heavy hitter.
Exactly. But unlike Shaykh Baha'i, whose writing is witty, poetic, and accessible with stories like Bulul and the Brick, Mir Damad's writing is notoriously, punishingly complex. The source text describes it as almost impenetrable.
It is incredibly dense, and there's a very famous, perhaps slightly apocryphal anecdote that highlights this perfectly. Later on, Mullah Sadra, who was actually Mir Damad's student, asks his old teacher a rather painful question.
What does he ask?
Sadra says, "Why is it that you are universally respected by the religious authorities and the clerics while I am constantly harassed, called a heretic, and forced into exile by those exact same authorities? We are teaching the exact same fundamental metaphysical doctrines."
And what does Mir Damad say to that?
Mir Damad calmly replies, "Because I hid my ideas within so many difficult expressions, complex terminology, and convoluted syntax that only the absolute elite philosophers could decipher them. The clerics couldn't understand me enough to condemn me, whereas you, Sadra, wrote so beautifully and clearly that anyone walking down the street could see exactly what you were saying, and that is what got you in trouble."
That is amazing. He essentially encrypted his philosophy to avoid the heresy hunters. So what exactly was Mir Damad hiding in all that incredibly complex prose? What was the really dangerous idea?
He was tackling one of the oldest, most intractable, and politically dangerous debates in all of monotheistic theology and philosophy: the question of the origin of the universe. Specifically, is the physical universe created in time, meaning it had a definite starting point? Or is the universe eternal, meaning it has always existed alongside God?
Right, and this is a massive trap. It's a complete philosophical minefield.
Yeah.
Because if you side with the philosophers like Aristotle and you say the physical universe is eternal and has always been here, the Orthodox theologians will immediately attack you.
Right, they'll be furious.
They will accuse you of diminishing God's power as the creator. If the universe has always existed, then God didn't really create it in any meaningful sense. You make the universe a co-eternal rival to God.
Exactly. But if you side with the theologians and you say, no, the universe was created at a specific moment in time, the philosophers will immediately tear your argument apart. They will ask, okay, if God is eternal and perfect, and he created the universe at, say, exactly 12 noon on a Tuesday,
Yeah.
what was God doing before that? Why did he wait? And more dangerously, what caused God to suddenly change his mind and decide to create the universe at that specific moment?
And why is a change of mind dangerous for God?
Because a change in mind implies a change in state. If you move from not wanting to create a universe to wanting to create a universe, you have changed. And in classical philosophy, only imperfect things change because they are striving for perfection.
Right.
A truly perfect, eternal, self-sufficient God cannot undergo change because any change would mean moving away from perfection. So Saying the universe was created in time implies a flaw or a mutation in the nature of God.
It seems like an impossible knot. You either diminish God's role as creator or you imply that God is changeable and therefore imperfect. How does Mir Damad untie this encrypted knot?
He solves it through a brilliant, paradigm-shifting categorization of reality. He splits reality into three distinct categories of time, or more accurately, three ontological states of relation.
Okay, let's go through these slowly because this is foundational. What is the first state?
The first category is what he calls Zaman. This is time as you and I normally experience it. Zaman is defined as the relation of changing things to other changing things. It is the physical world of cause and effect, of birth and decay, where everything is constantly in motion.
So me sitting here talking right now, my coffee slowly getting cold on the desk, the sun moving across the sky, that is all happening in Zon. Changing things, reacting to changing things.
Exactly. Now, jump all the way to the complete opposite end of the spectrum. The third category is called Sarmad, which translates to absolute eternity. Sarmad is defined as the relation of the immutable to the immutable.
The immutable to the immutable.
Right. It is the realm of pure, unchanging permanence. This is God's pure essence. In Sarmad, there is no before, no after, no change, no motion. Just absolute, eternal unity and perfection.
Okay, that makes sense. We have the changing, messy physical world of Zaman down here, and the completely unchanging, perfect, divine essence of Sarmad up there. But that just brings us right back to the original problem. How do they interact? How does a completely changeless God in Sarmad create a constantly changing universe in Zaman without compromising his changelessness?
And that is where the absolute genius of Mir Damad shines. He introduces the middle category, the bridge between the two. He calls it Dar.
Dar. How does Dar work?
Dar is defined as the relation of the immutable to the changing. You can think of it as the realm of the celestial archetypes, the permanent Platonic blueprints or ideas of all things that will ever exist. Mir Damad's revolutionary theory is called Huduth-i-Dari, which means eternal creation or origination in Dar. He argues that the creation of the physical world didn't happen in a sudden moment of physical time in Zaman. It happened in Dar.
This is a really heavy concept. The text gives us this incredibly beautiful analogy to help visualize Dar. And I want us to really build this out. Think of the moon shining at night, and its reflection is caught in a flowing stream of water.
It's a perfect analogy. Let's map it onto Mir Damad's categories.
Okay. So the image of the moon itself, high up in the sky, completely unaffected by the water that is like Dar. It is the archetype, the blueprint. It remains unchanged, luminous, and immutable. But the water in the stream that is Zaman, the physical world of time, the water is flowing continuously, rushing over rocks, constantly changing its exact physical makeup millisecond by millisecond.
But the reflection of the moon exists within that changing water. The reflection connects the permanent reality above to the changing reality below. The water, the physical world, is constantly being generated and passing away, but it is constantly receiving the permanent imprint of the moon, which is the archetype in Dar.
So because Dar stands above and outside of physical time, outside of Zaman, you can't even logically ask what God was doing before the world was created.
Yeah.
Before is a concept that only exists in the flowing water of Zaman. The world is created continuously with respect to Dar.
Precisely. The universe isn't a clock that God wound up once in the distant past. It is continuous, eternal emanation from the archetypes. This brilliant framework allows Mir Damad to thread the needle. He preserves the creative, generating power of God, which satisfies the theologians, while maintaining the philosophical necessity of an unchanging, eternal divine essence, which satisfies the philosophers.
It is a staggering conceptual leap. He completely redefined the dimensions of reality. But the School of Isfahan wasn't just made up of architect poets and complex time theorists. To fully understand the intellectual diversity of this greenhouse, we have to talk about the third member of this pioneer triumvirate, a man named Mir Finderisky.
Oh, he's fascinating.
Right. If Shaykh Baha'i was the Renaissance man and Mir Damad was the cryptic philosopher, Mir Finderisky was the yogi sage of the bazaar.
Mir Finderisky is such a fascinating contrast to the other two. While Baha'i and Damad were intimately tied to the elite Safavid court and the highest levels of religious authority, Mir Finderisky was utterly detached from all the trappings of worldly power.
Totally unbothered by it.
Completely. He was a wealthy nobleman by birth, but he lived a radically ascetic lifestyle. He wore coarse wool clothing, slept on the ground, and most remarkably, he traveled extensively outside the Islamic world. He spent years in India, actively mingling with Hindu yogis, really studying their traditions.
He didn't just study them, though. He deeply respected them. He actually wrote a philosophical commentary on the Yoga Vasista, which is a major Hindu philosophical text. That level of cross-cultural, interreligious, intellectual exchange in the 17th century is just incredible.
It speaks to his underlying philosophy that truth is universal, regardless of the cultural garments it wears. And because he was so focused on universal truth, he had this amazing, almost comical disregard for social hierarchy and elite decorum back in Persia.
There is this great story in the notes that perfectly captures his personality. Shah Abbas, who is the absolute ruler of the Safavid Empire, the man with the power of life and death, is walking through the common bazaar. And he spots Mir Finderisky, this highly respected, brilliant philosopher, sitting in the dirt, hanging out with thugs and commoners, watching a brutal cockfight.
Which is incredibly unseemly for a man of his stature, to put it mildly.
Right. So the Shah approaches him and tries to subtly admonish him. The Shah basically says, Mir Finderisky, you are a noble sage, a philosopher. You really shouldn't be seen in places like this, associating with this rabble. And Finderisky, without missing a beat, wittily replies to the Emperor of Persia, Rest assured, Your Majesty, I looked around very carefully and I saw none of the religious clerics here.
It is a brilliant, biting insult. He is essentially saying, the company here is much better and more honest than the company at your royal court.
Boom.
He was completely unimpressed by formal titles or societal rank, but this wasn't just a punk rock attitude on his part. It was rooted in a very deep philosophical view of society itself. In one of his major treatises on arts and sciences, he outlines a highly original 12-tier hierarchy of human society.
And what's crucial here is that this hierarchy isn't based on wealth or royal birthright or even military power.
Not at all. His hierarchy is based entirely and exclusively on the nobility of the subject matter that a person's daily vocation treats. It is a completely meritocratic spiritual ranking.
Who's at the top?
At the very top, in the first category, he places the prophets, the true saints, and the sages. Why? Because their subject matter is universal truth itself. Their daily vocation involves acquiring divine knowledge and taking actions from which only absolute good comes. They are the individuals who maintain the spiritual and moral order of the universe.
And on the flip side, at the absolute bottom, the 12th category, he places the sophists, the hypocrites, and the intentional deniers of truth. Because they also deal with universal subjects, but they use their knowledge to spread confusion, and from their actions comes only evil.
Exactly. And between those two extremes, he ranks every other profession. He moves down through the honest jurists who deal with universal legal action, down to the professionals in particular practical arts like physicians who deal with the human body or engineers who deal with physical materials, and further down to those who misuse those arts for selfish gain.
Think about how upside down that makes our modern world. If you apply Mir Finderisky's logic today, a billionaire investment banker who sits at the absolute top of our social and financial hierarchy would probably be ranked near the very bottom of Finderisky's list.
Oh, without a doubt.
Because the banker's subject matter isn't universal truth or alleviating human suffering. It is just the mechanical hoarding of capital. Whereas an underpaid kindergarten teacher, whose subject matter is shaping the minds and morals of the next generation, would be ranked incredibly high. He was mapping the metaphysical hierarchy of Hikmat directly onto the social structure. The closer your daily work is to universal spiritual truth, the higher your true rank in reality.
So if we look at the landscape of the School of Isfahan at this point, we have met three incredible minds. We have the architect-poet who proved the limitations of formal science. We have the cryptic theorist who built a bridge between eternity and time. And we have the ascetic yogi who redefined social value based on spiritual truth.
It's a stacked roster.
It is. These three masterminds cultivated the Safavid greenhouse. They generated a massive amount of raw intellectual and spiritual material, but the School of Isfahan was waiting for someone to put it all together. They needed one ultimate, once-in-a-generation genius to synthesize all these disparate threads, the rigorous logic, the architecture of time, the mystical poetry, the social hierarchies into a single, unified, bulletproof philosophical system.
Enter Mullah Sadra.
Mullah Sadra, also known by his honorific title, Sadra al-Din Shirazi, or simply Akhund the Master. He is the towering peak of this entire intellectual mountain range.
Let's talk about his background, because his life story perfectly mirrors the philosophical journey he eventually maps out. He was born in the city of Shiraz around 1571, and he wasn't born into poverty. He was born into a highly powerful, wealthy, and noble family. His father was the governor of the province of Fars.
Right, highly privileged.
Because of this immense privilege, young Sadra was sent to the capital, Isfahan, and received the absolute best education available on the planet at that time. He studied directly under both Shaykh Baha'i and Mir Damad. And being a certified genius, he mastered all the intellectual sciences, the logic, the math, the theology, incredibly rapidly.
He absorbed everything the early masters had to offer, but then, as he reached early adulthood, he hits a massive existential wall. It is exactly the crisis that Shaykh Baha warned about in his poetry.
The cat and the mouse.
Right. Sadra realizes that all this formal learning, all this ilm al-suwari, which means acquired, formal knowledge, isn't actually answering the deepest questions of his soul. It is just incredibly complex mental gymnastics. He can argue anyone under the table, but he realizes he doesn't possess true experiential wisdom. The cat of formal logic couldn't catch the mouse of inner truth.
So what does this young aristocrat with the entire world at his feet do? He drops out. Completely. He leaves the capital, he abandons the royal court, he gives up his political connections, and he retreats to a tiny, isolated, dusty village called Kahak, near the city of Qom. And he stays there in intense, punishing ascetic isolation for 15 years.
15 years of silence, fasting, and intense meditation. He sought to completely purify his soul. He was trying to achieve what the Sufis called the ilm al-laduni, which is direct divine illumination or intellectual intuition. He didn't want to just read arguments about the nature of God in a book. He wanted the mirror of his soul polished clean enough to see those truths directly reflecting in his own intellect.
And the incredible part is, it works. After a decade and a half in the wilderness, the illumination comes. He achieves the spiritual breakthrough he was seeking. He finally returns to the world of men. The governor of Fars built a massive new theological school in Shiraz, the Khan School, specifically for Sadra to lead. He spends the rest of his life there, teaching, training disciples, and writing down his monumental synthesized philosophy.
And it is worth noting, just as Mir Damad predicted, Sadra's clear, bold writings attracted massive hostility from the exoteric, literalist clerics who couldn't understand his mystical insights. They constantly tried to have him declared a heretic.
They hated him.
They did. The only reason he wasn't executed or permanently exiled is because of his lingering family wealth and his powerful political connections. His privilege provided a physical shield for his intellectual work.
And thank God it did, because that work is astounding. His ultimate masterpiece is a massive, multi-volume encyclopedic work known as the Asfar al-Arba.
The Asfar. The title alone is a fascinating piece of intellectual history. For a very long time, early Western Orientalist scholars who discovered the text were highly confused by the title. The word safar in Arabic means travel or journey, and asfar is the plural. So they literally translated it as the four books, or assumed it was some kind of physical travelogue of his time in the desert.
Right, like an early modern Iranian version of Eat, Pray, Love, but that is completely wrong.
Completely wrong. As Mullah Sadra explicitly explains in his own introduction, the title refers to the four profound journeys of the human soul's initiatic spiritual realization. The book is actually a highly structured map of spiritual ascent, but it is dressed in the rigorous, uncompromising logic of a peripatetic philosophical treatise.
Let's break down these four journeys because they form the architectural skeleton of his entire philosophical system. What is the first journey?
The first journey is the journey from the creature, from the multiplicity of creation toward the creator, the absolute truth. This is the initial awakening. This is the soul recognizing the illusion and the fleeting nature of the material world and striving to turn its attention upward, seeking proximity to God.
Okay, stripping away the worldly attachments to find the divine. What happens in the second journey?
The second journey is the journey in the truth with the truth. Having reached a state of proximity to the divine presence, the soul now immerses itself in the profound contemplation of the divine names and attributes. The soul is swimming in the ocean of divine reality, understanding the nature of God's qualities.
This sounds like the ultimate endpoint for most mystics. Total absorption in God. But Sadra doesn't stop there, does he?
No, because stopping there is incomplete. The third journey is the journey from the truth back down to creation, but this time, returning with the truth.
This is a crucial pivot.
It is. The soul, having been completely transformed and illuminated by the divine presence in the second journey, does not stay isolated in the spiritual realm. It must return to the messy world of multiplicity, to human society, but it returns permanently altered, carrying the light of divine truth with it.
Which leads to the fourth and final journey.
The fourth journey is the journey with the truth in creation. This is the ultimate state of the perfected sage, the true philosopher, or the prophet. It is living your daily life in the physical, material world, eating, working, guiding others, dealing with politics, but seeing absolutely everything through the clarified lens of absolute divine reality. You see God in everything, and you act accordingly.
What's fascinating here is how Mullah Sadra uses this specific four-part framework to achieve the ultimate goal of the School of Isfahan, the Grand Synthesis. For centuries, there were three distinct paths to truth in the Islamic world, and they were constantly at war with each other.
Yes, you had the path of formal revelation, meaning the literal text of the Quran and the traditions of the Imams. Then you had the path of rational demonstration, which was the peripatetic Greek philosophy of Avicenna, relying purely on logic. And third, you had the path of the purification of the soul, which was Sufi gnosis, relying on direct mystical vision. The theologians, the philosophers, and the mystics historically despised each other.
But Mullah Sadr builds a system that perfectly balances all three. He proves, using the most rigorous logic imaginable, that the mystical vision of the Sufis and the literal revelation of the Quran are all pointing to the exact same metaphysical reality.
He proves that true logic, true mystical vision, and true scripture cannot contradict each other because they're all just different languages describing the same underlying reality. And to build this unified system, to prove this mathematically and philosophically, he had to completely overturn how human beings view physical reality and existence itself. We have to move from Mullah Sadr the man to the foundational philosophical breakthroughs of his system. And this whole architecture starts with one fundamental question: the concept of being.
Yes, Section 4 of our source text dives into this, the unity and gradation of being. To understand how radical Sadr was, we have to look at the massive debate that was raging in Islamic philosophy at the time. It was the debate about what is fundamentally objectively real: being, or quiddities.
Let's define quiddities because it is a clunky philosophical term. Quiddity comes from the Latin quidditas, which basically means the whatness of a thing, its essence, its defining characteristics.
Right. So if I am looking at a wooden chair, is the fundamental objective reality of that object the fact that it exists, its pure being? Or is the fundamental reality the fact that it is a chair, its essence, its quiddity?
Earlier Illuminationist philosophers, like the great Suhrawardi, had forcefully argued that essences, the quiddities, were the true reality. They argued that existence or being is just an empty, abstract concept that human minds invent and stick on to essences to categorize them. For them, the chairness is real, the existence is just a mental tag.
But Mullah Sadr looks at this and radically disagrees. He establishes his foundational doctrine, the principiality of being. He flips Suhrawardi on his head. Sadr says, no, being is the only objective reality in the universe. Quiddities, the essences, do not have independent reality. They are merely limitations, borders, and negative spaces that our human minds abstract from the single, overwhelming reality of being.
The analogy provided in the text is incredibly helpful here, and we should really break it down.
Yes, think of a sculptor working with a massive block of pure white marble. According to Mullah Sadr, being, existence itself, is the marble.
Okay, so being is the raw material of reality. Where do quiddities come in?
The quiddity is the specific shape that the sculptor carves into the marble. Let's say he carves a highly detailed statue of a horse.
Yeah.
The shape of the horseness that is the quiddity. Now here's the crucial question. Does the shape of that horse have any independent, objective reality without the marble?
Of course not. If you somehow magically extract all the marble, all the actual substance, the shape of the horse instantly vanishes into nothingness. The shape is just a limit, a boundary placed upon the marble.
Exactly. Mullah Sadr is saying that the entire universe, everything you see, is one single, infinite, continuous block of marble. It is one single reality of pure being. The things we see, a tree, a star, a human, a chair, are just specific shapes, temporary limitations carved into that single block of being. The treeness, or the humanness, are just illusions created by boundaries. Only the being is real.
It is a stunning, unifying vision of reality, but it immediately raises a massive logical problem. If absolutely everything in the universe is just one single identical substance called being, how do we account for the massive, obvious variety in the world? If a rock and a human being are both made of the exact same marble of being, why are they so incredibly different? Why does a human write poetry while a rock just sits there?
And this brings us to the second half of his doctrine, the gradation of being.
Sadr explains that while being is indeed one single, unified reality, it exists at vastly different levels of intensity. The text uses a beautiful analogy regarding light.
Right. Think about the blazing sun at noon. Then think about a bright reading lamp in your living room. And finally, think about a tiny, faint glowworm in the grass at night. What are all three of those things made of?
They are all exactly the same thing. Light. The fundamental reality of the sun and the glowworm is identical.
But they're experiencing that reality at vastly, vastly different intensities. The sun is light at an overwhelming, blinding grade of intensity. The glowworm is light at the absolute lowest, dimmest grade of intensity.
And Mulassadra applies this exact same logic to existence itself. God, a human being, a soaring eagle, an oak tree, and a lump of coal are all the exact same substance, being. There is no fundamental difference in their marble. The only difference is their grade of intensity. God is being at an infinite, blinding intensity. A human is a lower intensity. A plant is lower still.
The text even explicitly says that because everything shares in the reality of being, everything possesses the qualities of being, like knowledge and will. The text says a stone has knowledge and will, just like a human being does. It's just that the stone's intensity of being is so incredibly low, so dim, that its knowledge and will are imperceptible to us. But it is there.
This is a profound, almost ecological shift in perspective. It means the universe is not a collection of separate, disconnected, dead objects bumping into each other. The universe is a single, living, continuous spectrum of reality. It stretches from the absolute blinding intensity of the divine essence all the way down to the dimmest, quietest existence of a grain of sand. Everything is connected because everything is ultimately the same thing.
Okay, this is beautiful, but here is where it gets really interesting. And honestly, this is where I have to push back as a reader. If everything is just one single spectrum of being, just light at different intensities, how does anything ever change? How does a seed grow into a tree? How does a child become an adult? This brings us to Mulassadra's most famous, most radical, and most difficult doctrine, substantial motion, or al-harakat al-jahariya.
This doctrine is where Sadra completely breaks away from thousands of years of Aristotelian dominance. To understand how radical substantial motion is, you have to know what he was arguing against. Aristotle and the Muslim philosophers who followed him like Ibn Sina believed firmly that the substance of a thing, its inner core reality, never changes.
Right. If you have a green apple, the appleness, the core substance, is static. If you leave it on the counter and it turns red and gets soft, Aristotle says only its accidents have changed. Its quality of color changed, its quality of texture changed, but its inner substance remained perfectly static.
Mulassadra looks at the universe, looks at the physics of reality, and says, no, Aristotle was completely wrong. The universe is not a collection of static, solid objects experiencing superficial, accidental changes on their surface.
He argues that the universe is a flowing stream.
He argues that the actual substance of the world, the deepest, most fundamental core of reality, is in a state of constant, violent motion. The substance of the universe is continuously annihilated and entirely recreated, regenerated at every single instant by God.
Wait, I really have to stop and push back on this, because this breaks my brain. You are saying that God is destroying and rebuilding the entire cosmos, millisecond by millisecond.
Yes. The entire cosmos is in a state of continuous inner transformation, a flowing river of substance, constantly striving to achieve a higher grade of perfection, a higher intensity of being.
But practically speaking, how does that work for me? If my actual substance, the core marble of what makes me me, is being destroyed and completely recreated from scratch every millisecond, how am I still me? How is there any continuity? If I was destroyed a millisecond ago, why do I have the memories of the guy who existed 2 milliseconds ago? Why don't I wake up as a completely different person?
It is the most vital question you can ask regarding this theory. If the universe is a meat grinder of constant recreation, where is the stability? Sadra's answer is brilliant, and it has two distinct parts. First, he appeals to the nature of perception. He argues that the incredible rapidity of the change makes the gaps imperceptible to the human mind.
Okay, so it's like a movie projector.
Exactly like a movie projector. If you look at a strip of film, it is just a series of static, separate photographs. But if you run them through the projector at 24 frames per second, the rapidity of the replacement creates the seamless illusion of solid, continuous motion. You literally cannot perceive the gaps between the frames. Sadra is saying the physical universe is God's movie projector running at an infinite frame rate.
Okay, I buy the optical illusion part. But a movie reel is still a physical strip of film. Who is painting the frames? What guarantees that the next frame of me looks like the previous frame of me? If it's being created from scratch, why doesn't the next frame look like a rhinoceros?
And that brings us to the second, deeper part of his answer. This is where Sadra borrows from his old teacher, Mir Damad. Remember the realm of Dar, the realm of the celestial archetypes.
The permanent reflection of the moon.
Exactly. Our continuity in the physical world is guaranteed by our permanent celestial archetypes in the intelligible world of Dar. While our physical material substance down here in the flowing water of Zaman is constantly being annihilated and turning over frame by frame, the blueprint, our permanent archetype in Dar, remains perfectly still and permanent. God recreates our next physical frame by referencing that permanent archetype. The archetype ensures that the new frame replacing the old frame maintains our identity and our accumulated memories.
Wow. So the physical world is literally just a flickering, rapid-fire projection of a permanent spiritual reality. And time itself, time isn't a container that we are moving through. Time, according to Sadra, is simply the measure of this continuous inner substantial motion. Time is just the friction of the frames changing.
It is an incredibly modern, almost quantum view of reality, conceived in the early 17th century. And if you accept this premise that reality is a flowing spectrum of being, it completely changes how Sadr views the concept of knowledge, too.
Because if the universe is a unified spectrum of being, then knowledge cannot just be a passive mechanical process. He totally rejects the Aristotelian idea that knowledge is just a passive reflection of physical things bouncing into the brain, like a camera taking a picture of a tree.
Right, because man is a microcosm, meaning the human being contains all the levels of reality within himself. From the mineral to the divine, knowing something is not a passive event. Knowing a truth is an actual elevation of the knower's being.
Explain the mechanics of that. How does learning elevate my being?
When you truly comprehend an intelligible, abstract truth, say, a deep mathematical or spiritual principle, you aren't just filing a fact in a cabinet in your brain. Sadra argues that the human intellect, the active process of intelligence, and the object that you are trying to know actually merge. They become one single reality. You actually merge with the truth you are contemplating, and by merging with it, your intensity of being increases.
So learning isn't acquiring data, learning is literally expanding your existence.
Exactly. And this profoundly solves the problem of God's knowledge. God doesn't have to look out at the universe like a spectator to know what is happening. God's essence is the ultimate mirror. He contemplates the permanent archetypes within his own essence, and by simply knowing them, he brings them into physical existence. For God, knowledge and creation are the exact same act.
If we connect all these mind-bending metaphysical concepts, the gradation of being, the constant substantial motion, the elevation through knowledge, it brings us to perhaps the most fascinating and deeply personal part of Sadra's philosophy. If the physical universe is this churning, flowing stream constantly striving for perfection, where does the human soul fit into that meat grinder of reality? We move from cosmology to the deep personal journey of the soul.
Sadra's psychology, his theory of the soul, is utterly unique. He rejects the traditional Neoplatonic idea that the soul is some pre-existing, fully formed, angelic entity that gets unceremoniously dropped from heaven into a physical body, like a pilot being dropped into the cockpit of a fleshy airplane.
Right, that implies a harsh dualism between spirit and matter. So where does the soul come from?
Sadra has a very famous foundational principle here. He states, the soul is material in its origination, but spiritual in its subsistence, meaning the soul is brought into being with the body, right in the messy matter of the physical world. It isn't dropped from above, it grows from below.
It evolves. The soul evolves from within the body's matter through the exact process of substantial motion we just talked about.
Exactly. As the fetus develops in the womb, the soul starts at the absolute lowest grade of being. It starts essentially as a mineral soul, possessing only the capacity to preserve its physical form.
Then, through constant substantial motion, it elevates. It levels up to a vegetative or plant soul, gaining the powers of feeding and physical growth.
It continues to churn and elevate until it reaches the level of an animal soul. Now it gains motion, desire, and the external senses like sight and hearing.
And finally, after birth and through life experience, it achieves the rare level of the human soul, gaining the capacity for rational intellect and spiritual intuition. It climbs the entire ladder of evolution from inside the body.
The source text features a perfectly poetic quote from Sadra, summarizing this entire evolutionary arc. He wrote, "The first seed of the universe was the intellect, and the last stage is also the intellect, which is the fruit of that same tree. The soul journeys through all the heavy, physical, material grades of being, just so it can return to the purely spiritual realm, but now with full consciousness."
But this brings up a terrifying question. What happens when the physical body, the soil that grew the soul, eventually dies and rots? The ancient Greeks believed that only the pure, rational, mathematical intellect survived death. They believed that everything else, your personality, your memories, your imagination, your emotions, all of that died with the physical brain. which is a pretty bleak view of the afterlife. You survive, but you survive as a detached, emotionless calculator.
Mullah Sadra boldly disagrees with the Greeks on this. Through his system, he argues that the human faculty of imagination is incredibly powerful. It isn't just a physical brain function that dies with the body. He viewed the human imagination as a microcosm of the divine cosmic imagination. He argued that the act of imagination is actually immortal. It survives the death of the physical body.
Okay, this brings up the most intense and frankly the coolest part of Sadra's theology. His eschatology, his view of the afterlife and the day of judgment. The orthodox, literalist theologians in Persia absolutely insisted on physical bodily resurrection. You must be resurrected with a body so you can physically experience the pleasures of heaven and the physical pains of hell. But if our physical bodies rot in the ground and our original atoms are scattered to the wind, how does Sadra explain bodily resurrection without breaking his own philosophical rules?
This raised a massive problem for Sadra. If he denied bodily resurrection, he would be executed as a heretic. But if he accepted a clumsy, literal reassembly of old bones, it would ruin his elegant system of substantial motion. His answer is truly revolutionary, and it relies heavily on that immortal imagination.
How does he explain it?
He argues that when the soul passes into the next world, it doesn't wait around for an external god to hand it a new physical body. Through its long evolution, the soul has become so powerful, its intensity of being is so high, that in the afterlife, the soul has the power to literally create external forms.
Wait, just like God's knowledge creates reality in the physical world.
Yes. The soul becomes a creator in its own realm. The organs of the resurrected body, the eyes, the hands, the skin that appear external to the person in the afterlife, are actually generated and projected outward from within the soul itself. The soul manifests as its own resurrection body based on its inner state.
So heaven and hell aren't geographical locations on a map that you were sent to. They are realities that you actively project.
Precisely. This is one of the most psychologically profound visions of the afterlife ever conceived. Heaven is the pure, perfected soul, unburdened by matter, creatively generating beautiful forms, lush gardens, flowing rivers, beautiful companions from its own inner perfection and peace. The soul surrounds itself with its own beauty.
And hell.
Hell is the impure soul, the soul that spent its physical life trapped by petty attachments, greed, and viciousness. When that soul crosses over, it is forced to suffer the ugly, terrifying forms, the fires, the demons, the tortures that it inevitably projects outward from its own diseased inner state. The fire of hell isn't an external punishment from an angry God. The fire of hell is the agonizing friction of the soul's own negative, substantial motion, forced to confront its own ugliness.
It is terrifying because you can't blame anyone else. You are locked in a room with your own soul. Though, the text notes that he does add a note of ultimate mercy to this system, heavily echoing the mysticism of Ibn Arabi. Sadra argues that because God's fundamental nature is being and mercy, eventually after the purification is complete, even the raging fires of hell will freeze over, and all souls, without exception, will return to the peace of the divine. It is an incredibly psychological, almost modern view of the afterlife, yet it is completely deeply rooted in the rigorous logic of Islamic mysticism.
A system this profound, this complex, and this highly mystical was bound to face massive friction when it collided with the rigid political realities of the real world. As we look at the legacy of Mullah Sadra and the School of Isfahan, we see a story of both incredible intellectual triumph and deep cultural tragedy.
Which brings us to the final act of our story. Sadra had several brilliant students who tried to carry the torch. The most notable was his own son-in-law, a man named Mullah Musin Kashi. Kashi was so brilliant he was often referred to as the Shia Ghazali.
Kashi's great historical achievement was taking his father-in-law's incredibly dense elite philosophy and perfectly integrating it into mainstream daily Shi'ism. He managed to harmonize the rigid exoteric law, the Sharia, with the esoteric, mystical, spiritual path, the Tariqah. He wrote texts that made Sadra's ideas accessible. He popularized the concept of vertical continuity, the idea that the physical world is a flowing stream recreated every single instant by the direct intervention of the divine names. He tried to teach the masses to see the flowing river of substance.
But the golden age of the Safavid greenhouse couldn't last forever. The political and intellectual climate shifted drastically. A highly dominant, highly conservative religious figure named Muhammad Baqir Majlisi rapidly rose to power.
Often referred to as the second Majlisi. He was an undeniably massive scholar, a man of immense organizational intellect. He compiled massive encyclopedias of Shia sciences and traditions. His most famous work, Bihar al-Anwar, is a staggering 24 volumes long. but he was fiercely dogmatic. He turned vehemently, aggressively against all forms of Sufism, mysticism, and abstract philosophy.
He viewed the philosophers as a threat to orthodoxy.
He did. He used his immense political influence at the Safavid court to actively persecute the Gnostics and the philosophers. He drove the study of Hikmat out of the public schools and forced it underground.
It is a devastating, tragic irony. The Safavid dynasty, which literally began as a mystical Sufi brotherhood, the Quizzle-Bash with the red hats fighting for spiritual unity, ends up, 2 centuries later, actively persecuting and hunting down gnosis and mystical philosophy. And there seems to be a historical correlation here because shortly after this intellectual closing of the mind, the dynasty physically collapses. In the early 18th century, the Afghans invade, they brutally sack the capital city of Isfahan, the great libraries are burned to the ground, and the Safavid Empire falls.
The Golden Age ends in fire and ruin. However, Mullah Sadra's ideas did not die in those fires. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, to the global picture of human thought, we can see Mullah Sadra's greatest and perhaps entirely unintended gift to the Islamic world.
What was that gift?
Think about what was happening in Western Europe around the exact same time Mullah Sadra was writing. The 17th century is the era of the great scientific revolution. Galileo, Kepler, eventually Newton. Their physical astronomical discoveries absolutely shattered traditional Christian theology in Europe.
Why did it shatter the theology so badly?
Because for centuries, the Catholic Church had tied its spiritual metaphysics inextricably, tightly, to Ptolemaic astronomy and Aristotelian physics. The Church taught that the earth was the physical center of the universe, and the heavens were made of unchanging, perfect crystal spheres. So when Galileo looks through a telescope and mathematically proves that Jupiter has moons and the earth moves around the sun, he didn't just break the physics, he broke the theology that was glued to it. When the physics was proved wrong, the entire metaphysical structure crumbled, leading to the massive secularization of the West.
I see where you're going with this. Mullah Sadra avoided this exact trap.
Exactly. Through his radical theory of substantial motion, and by making the study of the soul an independent branch of metaphysics, Mullah Sadra had completely divorced Islamic spiritual truths from the outdated, clunky machinery of Ptolemaic astronomy and Aristotelian physics.
Because in Sadra's system, the physical mechanics of the universe, whether the earth revolves around the sun or whether atoms are splitting, are just the changing, flowing frames of the physical movie projector. The physical rules can change, science can advance, but it doesn't threaten the permanent spiritual archetypes in Dar.
Precisely. He decoupled the spiritual truths of Islam from medieval science. This brilliant philosophical separation allowed traditional Islamic wisdom to survive the brutal onslaught of modern mechanistic science in the later centuries. It allowed Hikmat to remain a vibrant, living, intellectual tradition in Persia, passing from master to student in private circles, surviving political collapses, all the way down to the present day.
What an unbelievable intellectual journey. We started with a myth of a dark age, and we found an empire built by mystics in red hats. We walked through the architectural and poetic paradoxes of Shaykh Baha'i, untangled the complex time-bending theories of Mir Damad, mapped the spiritual social hierarchy of Mir Finderisky, and saw it all culminate in the towering genius of Mullah Sadra, a man who envisioned a universe that is a single glowing block of being, continuously violently annihilated and recreated millisecond by millisecond in a grand pursuit of divine perfection.
It is a profound, unshakable testament to the absolute vitality and brilliance of Islamic philosophy long after its supposed demise.
So what does this all mean for you? As we wrap up this deep dive, what does this highly abstract 17th century philosophy actually mean for you listening right now? I want to leave you with a thought regarding substantial motion. If Mullah Sadra is right, and the entire universe, including the cells in your brain, the fabric of your body, and the nature of your soul is being completely annihilated and recreated anew by the divine at every single instant, then the physical past actually has no hold on you. The person who made a mistake yesterday or even a millisecond ago literally does not exist anymore. You are a completely new creation right now, and right now, and right now. The universe is giving you a blank frame at an infinite frame rate. How does accepting that reality change the way you view your deepest habits, your heaviest regrets, and your boundless potential for the very next moment? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden genius of the School of Isfahan. We will see you next time.